The wind whispered through the long, dry grass, carrying the scent of sun-warmed earth and the faint, lingering aroma of leather and hay. Clara Whitfield sat in her battered wheelchair beside a broken-down wagon. The metal wheels sunk deep into the dry Montana dirt. Her gloved hands rested on the worn rims. The leather cracked and faded, much like the dreams she'd once held so tightly. Just a year ago, those hands had guided the reins of the fastest horses in the valley, her voice a soft murmur in a stallion's ear as she coaxed trust from wild hearts. Now those same hands gripped the cold, unyielding steel of her chair, a bitter reminder of the fall that had shattered more than just bones. She watched the dust swirl across the plains, the last rays of the setting sun casting long, lonely shadows. The ranch she'd once called home was gone, sold piece by piece to pay for surgeries and failed treatments. Pride had kept her from asking for help, even as her stomach twisted with hunger and the chill of the coming night crept into her bones. Then a distant silhouette broke the horizon, the slow, steady plod of a rider approaching, his shadow stretching long across the sunlit earth. Clara's grip tightened on the cold metal rims of her wheelchair as the rider approached, his figure growing clearer with each rhythmic thud of his horse's hooves. Dust clung to his long coat, the edges frayed from years of rough trails, and his wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his face, concealing his eyes but not the strong, set line of his jaw. She forced herself to sit straighter, pushing her shoulders back, willing herself to project the strength she felt slipping away with each passing day. She had once been a Whitfield, a name whispered with respect across the valley, a woman whose hands had tamed the wildest mustangs and whose sharp eyes could judge a horse's potential with a single glance. Now she was just another broken soul, another whisper in a dying wind. As the rider drew closer, Clara noted the fine leather saddle, the polished silver buckles that gleamed in the setting sun, and the sturdy frame of the horse beneath him, a powerful bay, its muscles rippling beneath a gleaming coat. This was no drifter. The man rode like someone who understood the land, who had the weight of ownership in every line of his body. She braced herself, her pride pricking at the thought of being seen in her current state, weak, hungry, and desperate. The rider pulled his horse to a stop just a few feet away, the animal's breath coming in steady, powerful huffs that stirred the dust around Clara's chair. He swung down from the saddle with a practiced ease, his boots hitting the ground with a solid, confident thud. The man straightened, towering over her, his shadow falling across her lap, and finally tipped his hat back, revealing a weathered face framed by dark, wind-tangled hair and piercing blue eyes that took in every detail of her condition without a flicker of judgment. "You need help, ma'am?" His voice was deep, gravelly, the kind of voice that came from years of shouting commands over the roar of stampedes and harsh winter winds. He didn't ask if she wanted help, just if she needed it. A subtle difference, but one that cut through Clara's pride like a hot knife. Clara's jaw tightened. She hated this, the vulnerability, the weakness, the constant fight against the pity that clung to every sideways glance from townsfolk who had once respected her. She forced her chin up, meeting his gaze with a defiance that had once made ranch hands step back, but now felt like the final flicker of a dying flame. "I don't need charity," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. She was painfully aware of the hollowness of her words, the way her stomach growled in protest against the lie. The stranger's gaze flicked to the rusted wheels of her chair, the cracked leather of her gloves, the empty canteen at her side, and the near-empty wagon bed behind her. His eyes returned to hers, sharp and unreadable. "Didn't offer charity," he replied, his tone matter-of-fact. He took a step closer, the leather of his boots creaking. "Just help." Silence stretched between them, the only sounds the soft snort of his horse and the whisper of the wind through the grass. Clara felt a tightness in her throat, a mixture of shame and defiance. She wanted to send him away, to cling to the last shreds of her independence. But the cold creeping into her bones and the hollowness gnawing at her belly reminded her just how thin her pride had worn. "I can manage," she said finally, forcing the words out as if each one cost her a piece of her soul. "I always have." The man studied her for a long moment, his eyes sharp and thoughtful, as if weighing her words, testing their truth. He nodded slowly, then reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a worn leather pouch. Without another word, he tossed it onto her lap, the weight of it surprising her. The leather felt warm against her fingers, and the faint clink of coins inside sent a jolt of both relief and shame through her heart. "Consider it a business investment," he said, his tone still level, giving her no room for prideful refusals. "When you're back on your feet, you can pay me back." Clara's fingers tightened around the pouch, her heart thudding against her ribs. She wanted to throw it back at him, to scream that she didn't need his charity, his pity, his silent judgment. But the words stuck in her throat, strangled by the memory of empty cupboards and sleepless nights spent wondering how much longer she could survive like this. The man turned back to his horse, adjusting the reins before swinging back into the saddle with a fluid, practiced motion. He glanced down at her one last time, his eyes catching the dying light and flashing with something she couldn't quite place. A challenge, perhaps, or a reminder of a world she no longer felt part of. "Name's Carter Barrett," he said, settling his hat lower over his eyes. "I run the Ironwood Ranch up north. If you're ever in need of real work, come find me." With that, he nudged his horse into a slow walk, the animal's hooves kicking up small puffs of dust as they moved away. Clara watched him go, the weight of the coin pouch still pressing against her lap, and felt something stir deep within her, a flicker of the fire that had once driven her, a whisper of the woman she used to be. As the last rays of sunlight slipped below the horizon, Clara closed her eyes, the warmth of the leather pouch still radiating through her gloves, and allowed herself a single, shaky breath. She had no idea who Carter Barrett was, or why he had chosen to offer her this small, unexpected kindness. But for the first time in months, she felt something other than despair. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her story. The morning sun crept over the distant ridge, casting long shadows across the worn boards of Clara's wagon. She sat in her wheelchair beside it, the leather pouch still resting on her lap, its contents a small but undeniable reminder that perhaps she hadn't been entirely forgotten by the world. The night had been colder than expected, the wind cutting through the thin blankets she'd wrapped around herself, and her fingers felt stiff as she worked to rub warmth back into them. She watched the horizon, half expecting to see Carter Barrett's silhouette riding back her way, but the road remained empty. She had spent half the night debating whether to use the money he had given her. Pride told her to stash it away, a last shred of dignity she could cling to, but her empty stomach had other plans. The faint memory of fresh coffee and hot cornbread, the simple pleasures of a life she had lost, had haunted her dreams, making the decision for her. With a deep breath, Clara pulled her gloves tighter and reached for the wheels of her chair. The morning air bit at her cheeks as she rolled toward the wagon bed, her movements slow but determined. She needed to make this small act of defiance against her circumstances count. She would get to town, buy the supplies she needed, and find a way to start over. She had been a fighter once, a woman who could break a wild Mustang and stare down the toughest ranch hands. She could find that strength again, even if she had to dig through layers of doubt and exhaustion to reach it. The wagon creaked as she grabbed hold of the side rail, the wood rough and splintered beneath her gloved fingers. She pulled herself up slightly, straining to peer into the cluttered bed. The remnants of her old life lay scattered there. Coiled ropes, rusted branding irons, a cracked leather saddle that had once graced the back of her favorite mare. She forced herself to look past these ghosts, focusing instead on the few essentials she still had left. A small hatchet, a dented tin cup, and a worn bedroll. It wasn't much, but it was hers. After a few minutes of awkward maneuvering, she managed to hook her fingers around the handle of a battered canteen, the metal cool against her palm. She unscrewed the cap and took a cautious sip. The water was warm and metallic, tasting faintly of rust, but it would do. She filled a smaller leather pouch with what remained, then tucked it into the side pocket of her wheelchair, securing it with a fraying leather strap. The road to town stretched out before her, a winding ribbon of packed dirt and loose stones that cut through the rolling hills like a scar. She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening on the rims of her wheels, and began to push forward. The ground was uneven, every small rock and rut sending a jolt through her arms, but she refused to slow down. She had made her decision. She would find work, rebuild her life, and prove to herself that she was still a Whitfield, still capable, still strong. Hours passed in a slow, grinding march. The sun climbed higher, its heat becoming oppressive, and Clara's breath came in short, strained bursts. Dust clung to her sweat-dampened hair and coated her tongue, each push of her wheels through the loose gravel feeling like a small act of defiance against the universe itself. Her arms burned, her palms ached, and every muscle in her back screamed for relief, but she kept moving. When the first low buildings of the town appeared on the horizon, she felt a surge of unexpected emotion. Relief, yes, but also a flicker of hope. She had made it this far. She could make it further. As she approached the outskirts, the familiar smells of smoke, horse sweat, and freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling in a way that reminded her of better days. She wheeled herself past a group of rough-looking cowhands lounging outside the saloon, their eyes following her with a mixture of curiosity and pity. She ignored them, focusing instead on the general store just ahead, its wooden sign swaying gently in the warm breeze. Inside, the air was cool and thick with the scent of leather and gun oil. Shelves lined with canned goods, boxes of ammunition, and coils of rope filled the small space, a stark contrast to the barren landscape outside. The storekeeper, a thin, gray-haired man with wire-rimmed glasses perched on the edge of his nose, looked up as the small bell above the door chimed. His eyes flicked to her wheelchair, a momentary pause that Clara had grown accustomed to before settling into a professional neutrality. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice polite but cautious. "What can I help you with today?" Clara hesitated for a moment, the weight of the coin pouch suddenly feeling heavier in her lap. She forced herself to sit up straighter, to project the confidence she barely felt. "Flour, beans, and coffee," she replied, her voice steady. "And a tin of axle grease if you've got it. My wheels are in need of a good oiling." The storekeeper's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded and turned to the shelves behind him, his movements quick and practiced. Clara felt her shoulders relax, just a fraction, as the small clinking of cans and rustling of paper bags filled the air. She had taken the first step. She was doing this. As the man placed the items on the counter, his eyes lingered on her hands, the calluses visible even through the thin leather of her gloves. She felt the urge to explain, to tell him that she wasn't always this way, that she had once been someone to be reckoned with, but the words felt hollow in her throat. "Traveling far?" he asked as he totaled her order, his gaze flicking once more to her wheelchair. Clara forced a tight smile, her fingers curling around the edge of the counter. "Far enough." As she handed over a few of Carter's coins, she felt a pang of mixed emotions. Gratitude for his unexpected kindness, shame for needing it, and a flicker of determination that reminded her of who she had once been. She might be broken, but she wasn't beaten. Not yet. With her supplies loaded into the small sack on her lap, Clara wheeled herself back into the harsh glare of the midday sun. Her head held a little higher, her shoulders set a little straighter. She had taken the first step, and for the first time in a long while, the road ahead didn't seem quite so impossible. The sun hung high overhead, casting sharp, unrelenting shadows as Clara made her way back toward the edge of town. Her arms burned with the effort of each push, the metal rims of her wheelchair hot against her calloused palms. She kept her head up, ignoring the curious stares from passers-by, focusing instead on the small, comforting weight of the supplies in her lap. The clinking of the few remaining coins in her pouch was a bittersweet reminder of her fragile independence. As she rounded the corner near the livery, she caught sight of the saloon, its swinging doors creaking in the dry wind. Voices and laughter spilled out onto the street, mingling with the clatter of boots against wooden planks and the sharp metallic ring of spurs. Clara felt a pang of longing, not for the drink, but for the camaraderie, the sense of belonging she had once known. She had been a part of this world once, a rider, a trainer, a respected hand on her family's ranch. Now she was a stranger, an outsider in the only place she had ever called home. She pushed on, passing the blacksmith shop where the steady clang of hammer on iron echoed through the narrow alleyways. A thin plume of smoke curled from the forge, its acrid scent mingling with the sweet, dusty fragrance of sun-baked hay and horse sweat. The smells pulled at her memories, dragging her back to the days when she could feel the powerful rhythm of a galloping horse beneath her, the wind in her hair, the world a blur of motion and possibility. Lost in her thoughts, Clara nearly collided with a young boy darting across the road, a wooden bucket swinging wildly from his small, dirt-streaked hands. He skidded to a halt just in time, his wide, startled eyes locking with hers for a brief, breathless moment. Then, with a quick, mumbled apology, he was off again, disappearing into the crowd with the energy only youth could muster. Clara exhaled slowly, her pulse gradually settling as she continued toward the edge of town. She was nearly past the livery when a familiar voice called out from behind her. "Well now, if it ain't the Whitfield girl, come back from the dead." Clara's fingers tightened on her wheels, her jaw clenching at the tone. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. She had hoped to avoid this particular ghost from her past, but luck had never been her ally. Slowly, she swiveled her chair to face the man leaning casually against the corner of the livery, his thumbs hooked in his belt, a smirk playing at the edges of his sun-cracked lips. Clyde Harker, a rancher whose land bordered her family's old spread, a man known as much for his sharp tongue as his rough, untrustworthy nature. "Didn't expect to see you back in these parts, Clara," he continued, pushing off the wall and sauntering closer, his spurs jingling with each step. "Heard you'd been laid up for good. Figured the next time I saw you, you'd be in a pine box, not rolling through town like a lost dog." Clara forced herself to breathe, to keep her head high and her hands steady on the rims of her chair. She had faced down charging stallions, wild-eyed Mustangs, and worse men than Clyde Harker. She wouldn't let him see the flicker of doubt that his words ignited in her chest. "I'm just passing through," she replied, her voice cool and controlled. "Got business to tend to." Clyde's eyes narrowed, his head tilting slightly as he looked her over, his gaze lingering on the frayed edges of her gloves, the scuffed metal of her wheelchair, the faint lines of fatigue etched into her sunburned face. "Business, huh?" He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt, his eyes never leaving hers. "Didn't know crippled cowgirls had much business left to tend." Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the old anger sparking to life in her gut. She leaned forward, her gloved fingers gripping the cold metal of her chair until they ached. "Be careful, Clyde," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "I might be down, but I ain't out. Not yet. And I've still got enough fight left in me to teach a snake like you some manners." The corner of Clyde's mouth twitched, his smirk twisting into something darker, more calculating. He leaned in close, the stench of stale whiskey and cheap tobacco clinging to his breath. "You've got a lot of nerve, Whitfield," he hissed, his eyes cold and sharp as a rattler's. "But nerve don't buy supplies, and it sure as hell don't put food in your belly. Maybe you ought to remember that before you go poking around where you don't belong." Clara met his stare without flinching, refusing to back down, even as her pulse pounded in her ears and her muscles tensed in anticipation of the blow she half expected him to deliver. But Clyde merely straightened, his smirk returning as he tipped his hat in a mockery of gentlemanly respect. "Good luck out there," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You're gonna need it." With that, he turned on his heel and sauntered back toward the livery, his spurs ringing out a slow, taunting rhythm against the sun-baked earth. Clara watched him go, her hands trembling slightly on the wheels of her chair, her mind a whirl of anger, shame, and a fierce, stubborn determination. She wouldn't let Clyde Harker or anyone else drag her back into the mud. She would survive, she would rebuild, and she would prove them all wrong. As the dust settled around her and the echoes of Clyde's footsteps faded into the distance, Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had made it this far, and she would keep going, no matter what the road ahead held. Clara gripped the wheels of her chair, the metal warm from the sun, and set her gaze on the distant silhouette of the old Whitfield ranch. The path stretched long and unkind before her, its ruts and rocks threatening to twist her wheels, to send her sprawling into the dust. But she had made up her mind. She would see her family's land again, even if it took every last ounce of strength she had. The wind whispered through the tall prairie grass, bending the stalks in gentle waves as if the land itself remembered her, welcomed her home. She paused at the edge of the property, the rusted gate leaning crookedly on its hinges like a weary old man. Clara pushed through, the gate creaking in protest, the sound echoing in the silence of the abandoned land. As she rolled up the long, weed-choked drive, memories flooded her. The low, sprawling house came into view, its roof sagging like a tired horse, the once bright white paint now chipped and gray. The barn leaned to one side, its doors swaying gently in the breeze, like a ghost beckoning her inside. She could almost hear her father's voice, the deep rumble of his laughter as he leaned against the corral fence, his weathered hat tilted back, his eyes crinkled in a rare, genuine smile. Clara felt a pang in her chest, a dull ache that spread like wildfire. She had been gone too long, and the land had suffered for it. Her father had always said that a ranch needed more than just hands to keep it alive. It needed a soul, a heart that beat in time with the rhythm of the land and the horses that ran across it. Without her, this place had withered, the spirit of the Whitfield ranch fading like the last rays of a dying sun. She paused at the edge of the barn, the scent of old hay and dry, cracked leather seeping from within. She remembered hiding in the loft as a child, peering down through the slats as her father trained new horses, his deep, calming voice soothing the wild-eyed mustangs. She had always admired the way he could turn a panicked, thrashing beast into a steady, trusting partner with nothing more than patience and a gentle touch. Pushing her way into the barn, Clara's wheels crunched over the debris scattered across the floor. Broken boards, twisted nails, remnants of old saddles and cracked leather. Dust motes swirled in the dim light, drifting lazily through the shafts of sunlight that filtered through the gaps in the walls. Her eyes adjusted slowly, and she spotted the old tack room, its door hanging slightly ajar. She rolled closer, her heart beating a little faster. Inside, the air was thick with the rich, comforting smell of oiled leather and horse sweat, a scent that brought a bittersweet smile to her lips. She ran her fingers over the dusty bridles and cracked reins, her thumb tracing the worn initials carved into the leather. W. Whitfield. Her father's saddle sat in the corner, the leather cracked and dry, but still bearing the unmistakable shape of the man who had once ridden it. Clara reached for it, her fingers brushing the worn edges, her mind slipping back to long rides through sunlit pastures, the wind in her hair, the world stretching endlessly before her. She was so lost in the memories that she nearly missed the sound of footsteps on the barn's dirt floor. Clara's head snapped up, her hand instinctively moving to the small, rusted knife she kept strapped to the side of her chair. "Thought I might find you here," a voice drawled from the shadows. Clara's pulse quickened, her muscles tensing as the figure stepped into the light, his face slowly coming into focus. Carter. He leaned against the barn door, his broad shoulders framed by the warm afternoon light, his face shadowed but unmistakable. He pushed his hat back slightly, revealing the sharp, stubbled line of his jaw and the intense, unreadable expression in his eyes. Clara's heart thudded painfully in her chest, a mix of fear, anger, and something she refused to name tightening her throat. She hadn't expected to see him again, not after their last conversation, not after the bitter words they had exchanged. But here he was, standing in the doorway of her father's barn like a ghost from a past life. "Carter," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "What are you doing here?" He took a slow, deliberate step into the barn, his boots crunching against the scattered debris on the floor. He looked around, his eyes tracing the worn, dusty remnants of a once thriving ranch, the memories etched into every beam and board. "Figured you might come here," he said, his voice low, steady. "Didn't seem right. You making this trip alone." Clara's jaw tightened. She forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to show the flicker of fear and doubt that his presence stirred in her chest. "I don't need your help," she said sharply, her fingers tightening on the armrests of her chair. "I'm not some charity case, Carter. I can manage just fine on my own." He held her stare, his jaw clenching slightly, the muscles in his neck tightening as if he were holding back a dozen sharp replies. But instead, he simply stepped aside, clearing a path for her to wheel past him. "Never said you were," he replied quietly, "but even the best riders can use a steady hand now and then." Clara's heart ached at the words, their quiet, unspoken meaning cutting deeper than she cared to admit. She looked away, her gaze falling on the old saddle in the corner, the ghost of her father's presence lingering in the worn leather and frayed stitching. After a long, tense silence, Carter took a slow step closer, his voice softer, almost hesitant. You don't have to do this alone, Clara. You've got people who care about you, who want to see you stand tall again, even if you can't stand at all. Clara's throat tightened, her vision blurring slightly as the weight of his words settled over her. She had spent so long pushing people away, building walls around herself, that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside her, to offer support without pity, strength without judgment. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun-soaked barn wash over her, the smell of leather and dust and hay wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. Then she drew a deep, steadying breath, straightened her spine, and opened her eyes. All right, Carter, she said, her voice strong and clear. If you're so set on being a part of this, then let's do it right. But I'm still calling the shots. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, the first real one she had seen in months, and he tipped his hat in a gesture of quiet respect. Yes, ma'am, he said, his eyes bright with a mixture of challenge and admiration. That's exactly how it should be. The morning air was crisp and sharp, each breath tinged with the earthy scent of dry grass and pine sap as Clara wheeled herself out of the old barn. The wheels of her chair crunched over the dirt and loose pebbles, the sound echoing through the empty corral where the ghostly silhouettes of horses once pranced and snorted, their breaths misting in the chill dawn. Carter followed a few paces behind, his steps slow, deliberate, as if giving her the space she needed to claim this ground as her own again. He had saddled his horse, a tall, muscular bay with a glossy coat, its breath puffing in the cold morning air as it stamped impatiently beside him. He paused at the barn door, leaning a shoulder against the rough, weathered wood, his eyes never leaving Clara as she crossed the uneven yard. The house stood silent and gray against the rising sun, its shutters hanging at odd angles, the paint flaking away like old memories. Clara paused for a moment, her fingers tightening on the cold metal of her wheels, her heart a heavy, slow thud in her chest. Carter seemed to sense her hesitation, his voice breaking the quiet. Looks like it's seen better days, he said, his tone soft, almost respectful, as if he were speaking in a church. But it's still standing. That's something. Clara's jaw tightened. She took a steadying breath, the cold air burning in her lungs. So am I, she replied, pushing herself forward, the gravel crunching beneath her wheels. She could feel Carter's gaze on her, the quiet weight of his presence, a strange, unexpected comfort. She rolled up to the front steps, the old wooden planks creaking under her weight as she transferred from her chair to the makeshift ramp she had fashioned from a pair of weathered fence boards. Carter stepped forward as if to offer help, then thought better of it, his hand falling back to his side. Clara reached the porch, her breath coming in shallow, misting gasps as she straightened in her chair, looking out over the land that had once been her world. The rolling hills, the crooked line of the distant fence posts, the wind stirring the dry, brittle grass like the whisper of a forgotten song. This place was everything to my father, she said quietly, her eyes scanning the distant tree line, the faint shimmer of the river that cut through the far pasture. It was his life, his legacy, and I let it fall apart. Carter stepped up beside her, his boots creaking on the old boards. You didn't let it fall apart, he said firmly. Life just took a different turn. That doesn't mean you can't set it right again. She looked at him then, really looked, her eyes tracing the lines of his weathered face, the hard set of his jaw, the quiet strength in his eyes. She had spent so long pushing people away, hiding behind her anger and pain, that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside her, to offer strength without pity, support without judgment. You don't know what it's like, she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady, to have everything you are, everything you've ever known, stripped away in an instant, to wake up one day and realize you'll never stand on your own 2 feet again, to feel trapped, helpless, like a ghost in your own life. Carter's eyes never wavered, his gaze steady, unwavering. No, I don't, he admitted, his voice low, rough around the edges. But I know what it's like to carry a weight you never asked for, to feel the pressure of a legacy you didn't choose, to struggle under expectations you never agreed to bear. Clara's breath hitched, her eyes stinging as she looked away, her gaze falling on the empty corral, the wind rustling through the dry grass like the whisper of a forgotten promise. You think this ranch is just a piece of land? A collection of broken fences and empty stalls? Carter continued, his voice gaining strength, each word a slow, steady hammer driving the truth home. But it's more than that. It's history, it's blood and bone. It's every ounce of sweat and sacrifice your family ever poured into this place, and it's worth fighting for. Clara's heart clenched painfully in her chest, a slow, steady ache that spread like wildfire, consuming the walls she had built around herself, burning away the fear and doubt that had taken root in her soul. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the wind brush against her face, the cold, sharp air filling her lungs, clearing her mind. She thought of her father, his rough, calloused hands guiding a nervous colt through its first steps, his deep, rumbling voice calming the wild-eyed mustangs, his fierce, unyielding pride in the land he had built with his own two hands. When she opened her eyes, the fear was still there, a dull, aching knot in her chest. But it was tempered now, softened by the quiet, steady presence of the man standing beside her, his shadow stretching long and strong across the weathered porch. "All right," she said finally, her voice clear, strong, unyielding. "Let's do this. Let's bring this place back to life." Carter's eyes brightened, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face as he straightened, his shoulders squaring as if he, too, felt the weight of the past lifting, the burden of old regrets and unspoken fears falling away like dry leaves in the wind. "Then let's get to work," he said, his voice steady, sure, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, a silent promise of support, of strength, of shared purpose. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the ranch yard, Clara felt something shift inside her, a slow, steady awakening, like the first stirrings of spring after a long, bitter winter. She took a deep, steadying breath, the cool morning air filling her lungs, her heart pounding with a fierce, unrelenting determination. This ranch was her legacy, her birthright, her second chance, and she would fight for it, no matter the cost. The days that followed were a blur of sweat, dust, and muscle aches as Clara threw herself into the work of rebuilding the ranch. Each morning, the sun rose over the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the broken fence lines and overgrown pastures, the air crisp and sharp with the promise of autumn. Clara refused to let her body dictate her limits. Her hands grew calloused again, her shoulders burned with the strain of wheeling herself over rough terrain, and her fingers ached from the constant grip on her chair's wheels. But with each passing day, the ranch began to come alive again, the echoes of her father's voice seeming to rise from the dry, cracked earth as she repaired fences, cleared debris, and coaxed the long-neglected soil back to life. Carter was always nearby, his quiet, steady presence a constant source of strength. He never hovered, never offered help unless she asked, but she felt his support like the solid, reassuring weight of a saddle beneath her, the firm, unyielding comfort of leather and steel. They rebuilt the main barn first, the structure still sound despite years of neglect. Carter worked the heavy beams into place, his muscles straining under the weight of the weathered timbers, while Clara directed from her chair, her sharp eyes catching every detail, every missed nail, every crooked board. The work was hard, unrelenting, but it felt good, right? As if they were breathing life back into the bones of a long-dormant giant. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the barn in a warm golden glow, Carter leaned against a freshly reinforced post, his shirt damp with sweat, his hands streaked with dirt and splinters. He watched as Clara rolled herself back toward the house, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but her head held high, her spirit unbroken. "You're doing it," he said quietly as she paused beside him, her eyes tracking the darkening hills, the shadows stretching long and thin across the pasture. "You're bringing this place back to life." Clara's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, her chest heaving with the effort of the day's work, but she managed a small, tired smile. "Not just me," she replied, her voice rough, her throat dry. "We're doing it. Together." Carter's eyes softened, a slow, quiet warmth spreading through his chest at her words. He reached out, his rough, calloused hand finding hers where it rested on her wheel, his grip firm, reassuring. Together, he agreed, his voice low, steady, the word carrying a weight, a promise that went far beyond the rough, splintered boards and freshly turned earth of the ranch yard. As the days stretched into weeks, the ranch began to take shape again. The pastures cleared, the fences straightened, the barns repaired and restocked. Clara's hands grew stronger, her arms more muscular, her heart lighter with each small victory, each broken board mended, each forgotten corner reclaimed. They brought in new horses, lean, muscular animals with bright, intelligent eyes and nervous, flicking ears. Clara watched them closely, her eyes sharp, her instincts honed by years of training and experience, her mind already racing with breeding plans, training schedules, future bloodlines. Carter followed her lead, his trust in her judgment unwavering, his respect for her knowledge growing with each passing day. He saw the way she handled the horses, the way her eyes softened, her voice gentled. Her entire being seemed to come alive in their presence. And he knew, deep in his bones, that this woman, this fierce, unyielding force of nature, was as much a part of the ranch as the wind in the trees, the sun on the hills, the life-giving water in the stream. One evening, as the first hints of frost crept into the air, Carter found Clara in the old barn, her chair parked beside the corral fence, her hands resting on the rough, weathered wood as she watched the horses moving through the fading light, their breath misting in the chill air, their coats glowing with the last rays of the setting sun. He leaned against the fence beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, the warmth of his body a quiet, steady comfort in the gathering darkness. They stood in silence for a long moment, their breaths mingling in the cool, crisp air. The sounds of the horses' soft, snorting breaths and the creak of the wind in the trees filling the space between them. Finally, Carter broke the silence, his voice low, steady, the words falling from his lips like stones into a still, deep pond. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the darkening hills, the slow, steady rise and fall of the land he had come to love almost as much as the woman beside him. "Someone who understands this life, this work, this place, someone who sees the world the way I do." Clara's hands tightened on the fence, her breath catching in her throat, her heart pounding with a fierce, unrelenting intensity. She turned her head slowly, her eyes finding his in the gathering shadows, her gaze sharp, unflinching. "I never thought I'd let anyone in again," she replied, her voice rough, raw with the weight of unspoken fears, unhealed wounds, the slow, painful process of learning to trust, to hope, to believe in something bigger than herself. "But you broke through that. You saw past the chair, past the walls, past all the fear and anger. You saw me." Carter reached for her hand again, his fingers warm, solid, reassuring against her cool, trembling skin. "I see you, Clara," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, his eyes bright with unspoken promises. "And I'm not going anywhere." They stood together in the deepening darkness, their breaths mingling in the cool night air, their hearts beating in quiet, steady unison. The sounds of the horses in the corral blending with the rustle of the wind in the trees, the soft, whispered song of the earth as it settled into the long, slow sleep of winter. And for the first time in a long, long while, Clara felt something stir deep in her chest, something bright, warm, unbreakable. She leaned into Carter's warmth, her hand tightening around his, her heart opening like a flower to the sun, her soul awakening to the quiet, steady promise of a future built on strength, on trust, on love. They stayed that way for a long time, the world around them growing darker, quieter, the stars beginning to prick the velvet sky with their cold, distant light, the ranch settling into the deep, steady rhythm of a life reclaimed, a love reborn. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt the weight of every struggle, every quiet victory, and every whispered promise of a second chance, let me know in the comments. Would you have made the same choices as Clara? Have you ever rebuilt something you thought was lost? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this journey, make sure you're subscribed for more tales of resilience, hope, and unexpected love. Until next time, keep riding, keep dreaming, and never forget that the strongest hearts find their way, no matter the odds. She stepped off the train with nothing but a suitcase, a silence she'd learned to live inside, and a letter from a man who didn't think she'd ever come. What she found wasn't a welcoming town or a waiting groom, but a ghost of a man with calloused hands in a cabin he didn't know how to share. She could have left, she stayed, and that changed everything. The train hissed like it hated the land it was leaving behind. Maeve Calder stood on the edge of the wooden platform at Callahan Ridge Station, watching as the last rail car disappeared into the distance. The smoke curled like a question mark into the pale sky before the wind scattered it across the canyon wall. No one else had gotten off. No one else had come to meet her. She was alone. Again. Maeve adjusted her grip on the battered valise she'd carried all the way from Boston. The handle had started to tear during the last change in Cheyenne, but she'd kept her sewing kit too far down to bother fixing it. Her gloved fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a strange mixture of fatigue and disbelief. She stared down the cracked dirt road that pretended to be a main street. Callahan Ridge, if you could call it that, looked more like a graveyard than a town. A half-collapsed mercantile hunched over at the corner. A chapel with one bell tower missing loomed at the far end. A saloon with no doors and a broken mirror propped against its wall. Wind moaned through the gap between buildings, as if the town itself was trying to remember what laughter had once sounded like. This was where she was supposed to begin again? Maeve reached into her coat and pulled out the folded letter, the last and only correspondence she had from the man who was meant to meet her here. Miss Maeve Calder, your application was accepted. If you are still of mind to travel, lodging will be provided. Matrimony will depend on compatibility, but assistance with cooking, livestock, and repair work is welcome. I live 3 miles north of the station. Ask for LF respectfully. LF no first name, no flourish, no photograph. Just those short, careful sentences written in block print. And now no man to meet her. She folded the letter again with slow, deliberate hands, slid it back into her pocket, and took a deep breath. There was no one at the station, no one at all. Just the faded sign nailed to the railhouse wall and a rusted trough half full of stagnant water. She adjusted her coat, threadbare second hand, and stepped off the platform. The road stretched in both directions, but only one path led toward the north, where the canyon narrowed and the trees thinned out into rocky hills. She started walking. The wind tugged at the hem of her skirt. Dust clung to the folds, turning navy wool into a dull gray. Maeve trudged forward, passing broken fences, sun-bleached bones, and the carcass of what might have once been a wagon axle. No birds, no dogs, not even the sound of insects. This place had been alive once. She could feel it. Now it was a place people forgot, on purpose. She'd seen it before. First in the alleyways behind her boarding house back east, then in the eyes of men who didn't ask names. You didn't have to dig a grave for something to be dead. Sometimes all it took was silence. It was nearly an hour before she saw smoke, thin, almost invisible, curling above the distant ridge. Hope struck her chest like a nail. She picked up her pace. Her boots weren't made for walking this far, not with soles half-worn and leather gone soft with overuse. But she kept going, ignoring the burn in her calves, the ache in her spine, the throb at the base of her neck where the tension always lived now. The path narrowed. Stones shifted beneath her feet. A rabbit darted out from a bush and vanished over a rock. For a moment she could almost imagine this wasn't insane, that there really was a man waiting for her, that this was all just a strange delay. But when she crested the last hill and saw the house, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like a dare. The cabin stood crookedly between two wind-bent junipers. The roof sloped awkwardly toward the east, patched in places with mismatched shingles. A narrow porch lined the front, one post missing, and the railing looked as though it had been ripped out and never replaced. To the left, a barn slouched into itself, one wall missing, doors hanging like tired arms. Smoke rose from a crooked chimney. A pile of freshly split logs lay stacked near the porch, and beside it, his back turned, stood a man. He was tall, broad, shoulders squared in a way that suggested strength hadn't left him yet, though time clearly had its hands on him. He wore no coat, just a linen shirt rolled to the elbows and suspenders that sagged with familiarity. His dark hair curled at the neck. A beard obscured most of his face, but she could tell it was unkempt, not styled. Like someone who no longer looked in mirrors. She stopped at the edge of the clearing. He didn't turn. She waited, still nothing. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm looking for someone. If I believe this is his property." The man stopped chopping, then slowly turned. His eyes were not startled. They were resigned, like a man who knew the storm was coming but couldn't be bothered to shut the windows. "I'm Maeve Calder," she said. "I wrote to you." He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "I didn't think you'd come." "Well, I did." He said nothing. The axe in his hand dripped sap. "You wrote to me," she pressed. "I wrote to a dozen," he replied. "Only one wrote back." She blinked. "And still, you didn't meet the train?" He shrugged. "Didn't think you'd get on it." Maeve let out a short breath, somewhere between disbelief and laughter. "You invite women into the wilderness, then hide when they show up?" "I didn't invite. I offered, and now?" He looked past her, out toward the path. "Now I'm surprised." She stepped closer, dust swirling around her boots. "I left everything behind." "I didn't ask you to." "I have nowhere else to go." He hesitated, then pointed toward the cabin with the axe. "There's a room on the left. You'll find firewood and a blanket. Stove works mostly." Maeve narrowed her eyes. "That's it? What were you expecting?" She stared at him, and he stared back. Then finally he added, "My name's Fen." The inside of the cabin was warmer than expected. The air held the faint scent of smoke, iron, and something herbal, like pine tea or crushed needles. The floor creaked. The windows didn't shut properly. A stove crouched in one corner, blackened and hissing. A shelf above it held only three things: a tin cup, a half-used candle, and a folded rag. The room on the left was small but clean. The cot looked handmade. The quilt had patches sewn over other patches. A cracked mirror leaned against the wall, too low to use without kneeling. Maeve sat on the edge of the bed and took off her gloves slowly, one finger at a time. The skin underneath was pale and raw. Not from the journey, from the years that led her here. She opened her suitcase, a comb, a book of poems, 3 changes of clothing, a jar of salve, a letter from her mother already yellowing at the edges, and the contract. She unfolded it, stared at the last line. Matrimony optional pending compatibility. It hadn't seemed strange when she read it in Boston. Now it felt like a punchline. Hours passed. She heard him move through the cabin, chopping, shoveling, cursing quietly under his breath when something crashed in the shed. He didn't knock, didn't check on her, didn't bring water. So she stood, rolled up her sleeves, and went to find it herself. The pump was out back behind the barn, old, rusted, squealing in protest. She pushed until water sputtered out, brown then clear. She filled a tin basin, carried it back inside, and washed her hands, then her face, then sat at the table, dripping, and waited. Finally, just after sundown, he walked in. She didn't speak. Neither did he. He placed a bowl in front of her. Stew, steaming, full of something that might have once been rabbit and definitely still was potato. She picked up the spoon. He picked up a cup. They ate in silence. "I didn't come here for pity," she said after a long while. Fen didn't look up. "I came because I wanted a place where no one knew my name." He raised his eyes then. "You picked the right spot." She held his gaze. Steady, tired, true. "I won't stay where I'm not wanted," she said. He nodded once. "Then you'll have to make me want you here." She blinked. "That a threat?" He leaned back. Number just the truth. Maeve stood. Her chair scraped against the floor. She didn't raise her voice, didn't cry, just said, "Then let's find out what truth is worth in a place like this," and walked to her room. Outside, the wind picked up again. The ridge howled like a warning, or a welcome. And in the quiet cabin, two strangers sat on opposite sides of a wall, neither quite alone, neither quite home, yet. The next morning, Maeve woke to silence. Not the city silence she knew from Boston, where the stillness was always stretched thin beneath footsteps, wheels, and distant voices. This was deeper, thicker, a silence you had to learn to breathe through. She sat up on the cot, her joints aching from a mattress too thin and a night too cold. The quilt, though patched and faded, had held warmth better than she expected. She ran her hands over its surface slowly, taking in the stitched stars and crooked lines. Someone had cared enough to keep it together. Not Fen. She didn't think he was the type. Someone before. She stood, pulled on her boots, and opened the door. The cabin smelled faintly of ash and earth. Fen was gone. No sounds, no fire, no footsteps. She stepped outside and was hit with a gust of dry wind that tugged at her skirt and made her braid whip against her back. Fen was in the distance behind the barn, swinging that axe again. Same rhythm, same stance, same scowl. Maeve took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and headed toward the water pump. She remembered where it was now, and she wasn't the type to wait for hospitality that wasn't offered. The pump squealed as she forced the handle down, spitting brown water into the tin bucket. She kept pumping until the stream ran clean, then bent low and splashed her face. The cold bit like pins across her cheeks, but she welcomed it. She didn't want to soften yet. She dried her face with the hem of her skirt and stood still for a moment, letting the wind dry the rest. From behind the barn, the steady thwack of wood splitting never stopped. He hadn't said a word to her since the stew last night. Not even good morning. She carried the bucket inside, set it beside the stove, and stood there waiting. For what, she didn't know. Eventually, she lit the fire herself. By the time he came in, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and heat. She'd set a kettle to boil, found a tin of dry oats in the corner, and made something that resembled breakfast. She didn't know if he'd appreciate it. She didn't particularly care. Fen stepped through the door and paused. His shirt was damp with sweat, his hands red at the knuckles. Maeve glanced up from her bowl. "There's hot water if you want it," he grunted. That was all. She didn't look away. You know, when a woman arrives by train from 2,000 miles away, the least you could offer is a hello. He dropped the kindling beside the hearth with a thud. "I offered you a room." "That's not the same as a welcome." He peeled off his gloves, then sat at the table opposite her. For a long time, neither spoke. Then he said, "What did you expect, really?" She blinked. "I expected a person, a man, not a ghost in the skin of one." His eyes snapped to hers, dark and sharp. "I'm not the one who got on a train chasing a stranger." "No," she said coolly. "You're the one who sent the letter." Silence fell between them again, heavy and brittle. Finally, he pushed his chair back and stood. "I'm going to the ridge." "For what?" "Work." "Need help?" He turned at the door. His expression was unreadable. "I don't know yet." She followed him anyway. The ridge was a half-mile north of the cabin, a jagged stretch of rock and scrub that looked down over a long-abandoned mine, and a stretch of forgotten rail track that hadn't seen a train in years. Fen led her to a stack of fencing wire and rotted posts. "Storm knocked most of this down," he said. "Coyotes get through now." Maeve rolled up her sleeves. "I've worked with wire before." He raised an eyebrow. She shrugged. Boston wasn't all tea parties. He didn't respond, but he didn't stop her. And that was enough. They worked in silence. He pulled the post. She held them steady. He drove nails. She tightened wire. They moved slowly, methodically, without small talk. The wind picked up. Dust settled in her hair. Her arms ached. Her boots filled with pebbles. She didn't complain. She watched him closely. The way he didn't curse when the hammer slipped. The way he checked each post twice before moving on. The way he didn't flinch when her fingers brushed his. He was a man who had built walls not just around his land, but his entire life. She wondered who had made him need them. Around midday they paused. Fen pulled a flask from his belt and handed it to her. She drank. Water. Cold and clear. "Thanks," he nodded. Still no smile. "You fix all this yourself?" she asked, motioning to the rest of the property. "I try." "You live out here alone?" He glanced at her, then looked back toward the cabin. "Used to be more." She waited, but that was all he said. They finished the last stretch just before the sun dipped behind the ridge. The fence stood crooked but solid, the wire taut. The coyotes, she figured, would have to work a lot harder now. Back at the cabin, he handed her another bowl of stew. This time she didn't ask what was in it. He ate at the table across from her. When they finished, she washed the bowls in silence. He dried. It was the first rhythm they shared. That night they sat on the porch again. The stars overhead were vast, scattered like fire across velvet. Maeve pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I was engaged once," she said suddenly. Fen didn't look at her. "But he said I talked too much, asked too many questions, thought too hard. His mother said I'd make a difficult wife." Fen took a sip from his cup. "Is that why you left?" She shook her head. "I left because I started to believe her." They sat in silence again. Then he said, "I had a wife once." She looked at him. His face was stone. "She died." Maeve didn't speak. He didn't continue. But it was enough. For tonight. Later, just before she turned in, she paused at the door. "You never told me what the F stands for." He didn't move. "Fennec." She blinked. "You're joking." "Worse, it's a family name." She smiled, the first real one since she'd arrived. "Well, Fenwick," she said, stepping inside, "thank you for letting me stay." He didn't answer, but he watched the door long after it closed behind her. And in the morning, there would be gloves waiting for her on the table. Her size, no note. But she'd know what they meant. The gloves fit perfectly. Maeve flexed her fingers, pulling the leather tight across her palms. The material was stiff, freshly oiled, she could tell, but already warming to her skin. She traced the seams absent-mindedly as she stood at the cabin's table, unsure if she should say anything about the gesture. Fen stood by the stove, stirring something in the pan. Eggs, maybe, or potatoes, or both. He hadn't said a word when she walked in, just nodded toward the plate and kept cooking. Maeve sat down, gloves still on. "Did you make these?" "No." "Buy them?" "Traded." She paused. "For what?" He looked at her. 3 fence posts and a bottle of whiskey. She blinked. "Seems like a steep trade." Fen shrugged. "You're the one with cold hands." They ate in silence. It had become a rhythm, a language of sorts, but Maeve couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough anymore. Not for her, and not, if she was honest, for him either. After breakfast, Fen grabbed his coat and went out to work on the roof of the barn. The tin had come loose during the last windstorm. She offered to help. He told her not to fall through. It was progress. Left alone in the cabin, Maeve cleaned. Not because it was dirty. Fen, despite his silence, wasn't careless, but because cleaning gave her purpose. It gave her permission to touch the place, to inhabit it. She scrubbed the counters, swept the corners, dusted the shelves. That's when she found the ledger. It was tucked behind a row of mismatched tin cans in the corner cabinet. Leather-bound, old, the pages yellowed and soft at the corners. She opened it slowly, fingers brushing ink faded with time and damp. Inside, names, dates, owed amounts. $3.10, salt, nails, twine. 0.85, sugar, tobacco. $12, horse repair, partial payment only. G. Boone, balance cleared. Boone. Her finger paused on that name. Fen's last name was Fenwick, but something about the entry made her freeze. Boone was written in darker ink. She turned the page. More names, most crossed out, a few circled, one with a red X beside it. At the bottom of the ledger, in newer handwriting, account suspended, settlement void, pay no further visits. Maeve frowned. The handwriting was Fen's. She closed the book slowly, set it back in its place. But something in her chest had shifted. This place had once been a business, a trade post perhaps, or something more. Now it was a husk, and Fen? He wasn't just a man hiding from grief. He was a man whose entire life had been left behind with no one to claim it. That evening after supper, she asked, "What happened to the ledger?" Fen didn't look up from where he sat, whittling a block of wood into what might one day become a spoon. "I burned the rest." "Why?" "No one pays anymore." "Doesn't mean it didn't matter." He blew a curl of shaving dust from the wood. It did once. And now? He looked at her, and for the first time the stillness in him broke. Now I build fences, feed dogs, eat stew. Maeve leaned forward, elbows on the table. What happened to the people? Fen stared at the fire for a long time. Then, they left. Why? He didn't answer. She waited. Still nothing. So she stood, crossed to the shelf, and pulled the ledger out. She set it between them. You wrote this. He didn't deny it. You kept track. You helped people. There's value in that. They didn't think so. What happened, Fen? He ran a hand down his beard, let out a slow breath. There was a fire. Maeve's breath caught. He continued. Late summer, 2 years back, started in the dry ridge grass. No rain, wind caught it, swept through the canyon. His voice dropped. I lost the barn, the south field, half the house. And your family? He nodded. Maeve sat slowly. I'm sorry. I rebuilt what I could. Most folks didn't. Silence again. Then he said, almost too soft to hear. She was gone before that, though. Maeve didn't ask who. She didn't need to. I didn't tell her I loved her, he said. Not once. Maeve's heart cracked. I didn't think I had to. Thought it was enough to be there. He looked at her then. I was wrong. That night, Maeve didn't sit on the porch. She sat beside the hearth, fingers wrapped around her cup, eyes on the flames. Fen joined her, still silent, but closer now, within reach. Later, just before sleep, she stepped out to check the water bucket. The stars overhead were sharp and brilliant, the kind that only appear in places where silence is the loudest sound. She turned back toward the cabin and froze. Fen was standing in the doorway, backlit by firelight, watching her. Not like a guard, like a man who'd forgotten how to hope. She didn't say anything, but she didn't look away, and for the first time, he didn't either. The next morning when she came to the table, the ledger was waiting, open to a blank page, and beside it, a pencil. Her name had not been written yet, but the space was there, waiting, just like her. Maeve felt the shift before she saw it. It was in the way the dogs stopped barking, in the birds that didn't return to the treetops that morning, in the way Fen stepped out of the cabin and turned his head, slow and certain, like he smelled something foul riding the wind. She was peeling potatoes near the pump when she noticed. Fen was staring down the ridge trail, still as stone, shoulders set. Someone's coming, he said. She didn't ask how he knew. She just stood, wiping her hands on her apron, and waited. By mid-afternoon, a horse's hooves echoed down the dry canyon path. One rider, a man. He wasn't hurrying. People who come in peace tend to do so with urgency. This one rode like time answered to him. The horse was black and dust-laced, ribby in the haunches. The man atop it wore a tan duster, frayed at the cuffs, and a wide hat pulled low over one eye. The other eye, what could be seen of it, glinted sharp and cold. Maeve took one look and knew. It wasn't just someone, it was him. Fen stood between her and the trail, unmoving. The man rode close, dismounted slow. Boots hit the earth with practiced arrogance. He tipped his hat. Didn't expect to find the place still standing. Fen didn't answer. The man looked past him, eyes landing on Maeve like a wolf catching scent. Well now, he said softly, aren't you a pretty thing to find out here? Maeve didn't flinch, didn't move, but her grip on the wooden basin tightened. Fen's voice was low. Say your name. The man smiled. Why? You ain't the sheriff. No, Fen said, but I'm the only law she has out here. A beat of silence. Then, name's Caleb Winton. Maeve stiffened. Fen felt it. He didn't turn around. Just said, You know him? She nodded. From Boston? No, she said. From the part I don't talk about. Caleb chuckled. Well, now that's a welcome. He reached into his coat, not fast, not slow, and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Held it up. Got a contract here, he said. Signed by a one Mr. Bernard Calder, her daddy. Fen didn't take it. Caleb stepped closer. Marriage agreement. Dated. Witnessed. Claimed, Fen repeated. Ain't that how things go out here? Caleb said. Men claim land, livestock, women. Maeve spoke now. He's lying. Caleb turned toward her, his grin wide. Now, sweetheart, we both know that ain't true. Your daddy signed that paper, traded it for a train ticket and a bottle of rye. She stepped forward. I was 17. Caleb raised a brow. 18 by the contract date. Legal Fenn's voice dropped. And what's your interest in it? Debt, Caleb said. He owed. She was payment. I let her run once. Figured I'd collect later. You're not collecting anything, Fenn growled. You sure? Caleb looked around. Ain't much law left in Callahan Ridge, and the nearest judge sits 2 counties east. Fenn didn't blink. Then I guess you'll need to ride. Caleb stared. Fenn didn't move, and behind him, Maeve, though pale, stood firm. You'd kill for her? Caleb asked softly. Fenn said nothing, but the look on his face answered everything. Caleb nodded slowly. Well then, he said, I'll be in the hills a few days. Maybe you'll reconsider. He stepped onto his horse, spat into the dust, and rode back the way he came. The silence afterward felt loud. Fenn turned to Maeve. You all right? She nodded. He's not just a collector, she said. He used to run girls from the docks, the kind no one missed. Fenn's jaw tensed. He came for me once. My father offered me like a coin purse with a hole in it. I ran. You're not running now. No, she said. Now I'm building. Fenn looked at her. You should leave. He might not come back alone. Maeve stepped closer. I'm not leaving you. He blinked. You'd stay for me? I'd stay for me, she said. But you're the reason I can. That night, Fenn brought out the rifle. He handed it to her. It's not much, and he said, but it shoots straight. She held it, then nodded. Good, because I won't miss. They slept in shifts. Fenn sat on the porch through the deep hours. Maeve lay in the bed, boots still on, eyes wide in the dark. Morning came with the smell of rain and a silence more watchful than ever. The trail stayed empty, but the fear didn't, and neither did the resolve. Later that day, Fenn took her to the shed, showed her the shelves, the tools, the way the latch stuck unless you pressed down. He showed her the back exit, just in case. She looked at him and said, You think he'll come at night? He didn't answer. She nodded. Then I'll be ready. That evening, just before dusk, a piece of rope was found hanging from the fence post. A noose. Crude. Deliberate. Maeve stared at it for a long time, then took it down and threw it into the fire. Fenn didn't say anything. He just watched her do it. And when the flames swallowed the threat, she whispered, You can't hang what won't kneel. That night they sat closer, not touching, but not apart. Fenn finally asked, Why'd you answer the ad? Maeve hesitated. Then, because I didn't want to disappear. I wanted someone to know I was still here. He looked at her. You are. And that somehow was the first thing she truly believed since she stepped off that train. The storm arrived at dusk, not the kind that broke the sky with thunder and rain, but the kind that came on horseback, boots heavy in stirrups, hate riding just beneath the saddle. Maeve saw him first. She was near the pump, refilling the basin, when she heard the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth. Not fast, not urgent, just inevitable. Caleb Winton came back with 2 men this time, one thin as a rail, the other wide as a haystack, both with guns slung low and eyes that didn't blink enough. Fenn stepped out from the barn before she could call to him, rifle already in hand. They stood shoulder to shoulder now. No more hiding. No more walls between them. Only this. You get my message? Caleb called. Maeve didn't respond. Fenn did. She burned it. Caleb's smile twitched. Now that's ungrateful. She's not yours to be grateful to. She's not yours either. Fenn raised the rifle just slightly. Number. But she chose to stand here. You rode in thinking you'd scare us. He paused. But you should have brought more men. The thin one shifted in his saddle. The heavy one scratched his chin. Caleb narrowed his eyes. This don't have to get bloody. Fenn said, Then leave. Maeve stepped forward. Number, let me. Fenn blinked but didn't stop her. She walked to the edge of the porch, skirt brushing dust, rifle in her hand but not raised. She faced Caleb head on. You think I'm afraid of you because you've got a paper? Because my father signed something he had no right to? Caleb said nothing. Maeve's voice didn't shake. I'm not 17 anymore. I'm not someone's debt. I'm not something to collect. Caleb's grin returned. You sure? Because the girl I met back then couldn't hold a man's eyes, let alone a rifle. She cocked the weapon. Loud. Sharp. I'm not aiming for your eyes. That changed things. The thick one reached for his belt. Fen moved faster. Gun up. Ready. Try it, he said flatly. I haven't fired in 5 years, but I never missed before. The man hesitated. The thin one looked at Caleb. Well? He asked. Caleb's grin faded. His gaze shifted to the sky, then to Maeve, then to the empty town behind her. There's nothing out here worth dying over, he muttered. Then you shouldn't have come, Fen said. Caleb spat in the dirt. No law out here, he said. Maeve stepped forward. There is now. Caleb locked eyes with her. You'll regret this. She didn't blink. No, she said. You will. They turned. Slow. Caleb mounted last. He didn't look back, but he didn't ride fast either, like a man trying to pretend he'd made the choice to leave. Maeve stood still long after the sound of hooves faded. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear, from release. Fen stepped beside her. You all right? She nodded, but said nothing. He reached for the rifle, took it gently from her grip, and set it down inside the door. Then he stepped close, not just beside her, with her. And in that moment, all the silence between them collapsed. He didn't ask. He just brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, slow as dusk settling over the land, and kissed her. No fire, no frenzy, just wait. Truth, a promise unspoken. Her fingers curled into his shirt, not pulling, just holding. And when they parted, she whispered, I didn't think I'd survive that. You didn't, he said. You rebuilt. That night, they didn't sit on opposite sides of the fire. They shared the same chair, and when the wind howled, they listened, not in fear, but in understanding. Because storms don't always come to destroy. Sometimes they come to clear. Later, as she lay in the bed, his bed now too, Fen sat beside her, boots off, coat draped over the chair. He traced a scar on her wrist with a fingertip. You don't have to tell me, he said. But I will, she replied. And she did. Quietly, not all at once, but enough. About the alley, the deal her father made, the way she ran, the years she spent looking over her shoulder, never daring to build anything that could be taken away. You built this, he said finally. Not yet, she replied, but we're getting there. And then he told her about the fire, about the ledger, the lost neighbors, the wife who smiled at dawn and never saw dusk, about how he thought silence was safer than sorrow. But it just got louder, he said. Maeve kissed his fingers. You've earned quiet again, she said, but this time I want to share it with you. They slept without fear for the first time, and when morning came, nothing had changed outside, but everything inside had. Spring came in quietly. There was no grand thaw, no sudden explosion of green, just a slow lifting of the cold. The wind turned warm first, brushing against Maeve's cheeks with something like apology. Then the creek began to trickle again. The sky shifted from steel to soft blue, and the night stopped biting. Maeve stood at the edge of the garden one morning, with her sleeves rolled and her fingers in the earth. She'd never planted a seed in her life until now. Boston hadn't offered her ground, only concrete, alley shadows, and windows too high to reach. But here she had soil, water, light, and her name. Fen was fixing the porch rail, again, this time with new wood, cut clean, sanded by hand. She'd teased him that the old one had personality. He'd grunted and said it also had termites. She didn't argue, not anymore, because now he whistled when he worked, only a little, off-key, but she noticed. He only did it when he was at peace, and he only did it when she was near. The ledger remained on the shelf, open to a new set of pages, not for debts, but for plans. She wrote in it now, too, notes about how many chickens they might raise, how much seed they'd trade with the Finch family, whether it was worth repairing the second corral. Fen watched her with something just short of wonder every time she made a mark. "I think you like order," he said once. "I like knowing we'll still be here in the fall." He nodded. "And maybe next spring, we plant fruit trees." "You think we'll be here that long?" She met his eyes. "We better be." The old mail trail came alive again by early summer. A boy on a pony brought letters once a month. They weren't expecting any, but one day the boy handed her a folded envelope. No return address, no wax seal. The handwriting was familiar, shaky. Maeve opened it with steady hands. Inside, "Maeve, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I only hope you're somewhere better. I'm sorry I let him take your name like it was something to give away. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder. I left because I thought disappearing would protect you. I see now it only taught you to do the same. If you can forgive me, do. But if you can't, I understand. I think you always deserved more than I ever knew how to give. Your mother." Maeve read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the fire. Not out of anger, but peace. One morning she stepped out of the cabin and found Fen near the old corral, brushing the mane of a small chestnut mare. "Where'd she come from?" she asked. "Traded with Dawson," he said. "Figured we need more than one horse if we're going to be a real place." Maeve raised a brow. "A real place?" He smiled slow. "You know, with barns, with gardens, with futures." She approached. The mare nuzzled her shoulder. Maeve looked at Fen. "You thinking long-term now?" He brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm thinking I've never wanted anything to last this long." That night, under the stars, they sat on the finished porch swing, her head resting on his chest, their hands folded together like roots grown into each other. Maeve spoke first. "I never thought I'd be loved without being claimed." Fen didn't answer right away, then said, "You're not claimed. You're chosen." Her breath hitched. "I choose you," Maeve called her. She looked up at him. "I choose you too, Fenwick Boone." Weeks later, they carved their initials into the porch post. MC plus FB, simple, permanent. No one else would ever see it but them. But that was enough, because what they built wasn't for show, it was for staying. Fall came, slow and gold. The trees turned with grace. Maeve's garden overflowed. Carrots, beans, squash that wouldn't stop growing. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and stew. Fen started carving small animals from leftover pine, leaving them on the windowsill for her to find. One night he handed her a box. Inside a ring, birchwood, polished smooth. "I can't promise a preacher," he said. "I don't need one," she said. So they married under the same stars that once watched her arrive. No guests, just the land, and the silence that now meant peace. Months passed, then years, and still, they stayed. The garden became a field. The cabin became a home. The place no one remembered became the place people passed through, and sometimes stayed. Widows, runaways, quiet men with tired eyes. Maeve welcomed them all, with stew, with work, with safety. They never asked questions, but they always stayed longer than they meant to. One winter evening, as snow fell softly across the hills, Fen took her hand and whispered, "We did it." Maeve looked around. The swing, the lantern, the smoke from the chimney. "We are doing it," and she smiled, because nothing else ever felt more true. They said there was nothing left in Callahan Ridge. No law, no reason to stay. But she stayed, not because he asked her to, but because for the first time in her life, she had the right to choose her own story. Not as a debt, not as someone else's burden. And he didn't try to fix her. He didn't rush to save her. He simply offered what no one else had. Space, time, a silence that didn't punish, a roof that didn't leak, a bed that didn't come with conditions, a home not built of stone, but of slow trust. Together they planted seeds in broken ground, inside the earth and inside each other. What started as a letter in a train ride through nowhere became something real. A garden, a porch swing, 2 initials carved into wood. She was never someone's property again. She became someone's partner. And he, once buried in grief, finally stepped into the light, not as a rescuer, but as a man with something left to offer. In that quiet place, they made room for others like them, the ones who'd been told they were too much, too broken, too late. Because healing doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just sits beside you and says, "I'm not leaving." And that's how you know it's real. Not because it promises the world, but because it shows up every morning and asks how you take your coffee. We'd love to hear from you. Did this story remind you of someone who stayed when they didn't have to? Or maybe you were the one who stayed, the one who chose to love quietly, fiercely, without applause. Let us know in the comments. Your words might be what someone else needs to keep going. And if this story touched you, share it. Not for us, for the next person standing at the edge of a porch, wondering if they're allowed to stay.